So yeah, let's just get started. I want to thank some of my colleagues who helped prepare these slides. So the slides are variations of slides that I made with these colleagues. And in the top right corner of each slide, you'll see some citations that you can look at if you want to kind of do further reading. Okay, so if we start with the introduction, I'd like to begin, as I often do, by referencing a philosopher named Plato, which I'm sure you've heard of. Plato is this guy here, pointing at the sky. He lived about 2,500 years ago. And the reason I'm interested in Plato is because of this allegory of the cave that he came up with. And what he said was that basically human beings, we are like these bound observers at the bottom of a cave. And we are looking at a screen in front of us or a wall in front of us. Behind us are a series of objects, and behind those objects is some firelight. And the firelight creates light that casts onto these objects and therefore casts a shadow in front of us. And what Plato says is that we humans, we can only ever see these shadows. We never get to observe the objects directly. And he was using this allegory to explain what it feels like to try and understand reality given the limited perceptions that we have of it. And I really like this allegory because it has very strong connections, I feel, to what it's like to do computer vision. And I'll explain in a second how. So if we kind of break down the allegory, we have the true objects that create 2D images in front of us. And we observe those images and then form representations in our heads that try to capture some essence of that truth. So for instance, we might be looking at a vase. That vase creates a 2D pixelated image. Maybe it's black and white. If we had old sensors, new sensors are color, obviously, but they're still two-dimensional. And then what we want is we want the human or the computer to think of the concept of a vase in their head when they see this image. And in some sense, this is the computer vision problem, right? The problem of going from this image to this representation is computer vision. Now, what I call the representation problem, it stems from the fact that actually, any object or any scene or any aspect of reality has many attributes that you might want to represent. So of course, there's the class of the object, but the object has a shape, it has a color, it has a height, it has a weight, maybe it has a property like whether it's scratched or not, maybe it's moving, maybe it's not. And the question that this system will have to answer, or there's several questions, but those questions involve, which attributes am I going to represent? Which attributes do I care about and which ones do I not care about? In what format am I going to represent those attributes? For instance, will I represent them as numbers or strings or something else? How do I deal with partial observability? So for instance, this is a black and white image. It doesn't give me any information about the color of the object. What do I do? How do I represent my uncertainty over those attributes? How quickly do I form this representation? Does it take me hours or can I do it in a split second? And what is my measure of success? Remember, this person never gets to observe these objects directly. So they never have direct access to the truth. So how do they know that they're representing the world accurately or not? And of course, this is a huge problem in philosophy, but it turns out to be a problem in computer vision too. Now, as many of you will know, there is a well-understood solution to this, and that is the supervised solution. And it works in many cases. So let's go through what that solution looks like. So what you do first in the supervised approach is you decide in advance which attributes you care about. So for instance, you say, you know what, I only care about classes. I don't care about shapes or colors or anything else. Then you decide the format for each attribute. So here I say, I want to represent class with a string. So I'm going to say, this is a vase, this is a ball, this is a dog. Then you create a large data set of images and labels, like I have here on the right, and then you train a neural network to predict those labels. And if your data set's big enough and your neural network is big enough also, then you can get really good results. And in industry and academia, we've seen this play out extremely well over the past 8 years or so. However, there's a bunch of questions that are perhaps useful to think about, which encourage us to consider alternatives to this approach. So first of all, who provides the ground truth for these labels? So a human being creates this label for a vase, ball, and dog. What if they make mistakes? What if it's expensive to gather their labels? What if no one knows the ground truth? So for instance, imagine you're trying to understand the galaxies in the sky, or you're trying to understand small objects like molecules. Maybe there's no human being that actually knows the true label for that galaxy, because obviously we've never been there. Does that mean that we can never use machine learning to understand those objects? And of course, which attributes are chosen, which ones are ignored, that can have lots of even political implications, but also like ethical implications. Which attributes are ignored, as I said. What biases do these labels have? Of course, humans can make systematic mistakes in labeling reality, and that can have huge knock-on effects on how AI systems interact with the real world and interact with human lives. And then perhaps most importantly, question 6 and 7, from a research perspective, do we think that children learn purely from labels in this way, in this supervised way? Do we really believe that, the fact that we understand what cats and dogs are is because we've seen thousands of labels for cats and dogs? Or was there some other mechanism that allowed us to learn quickly what a cat is and what a dog is? And in fact, do animals learn from labels? Animals, generally speaking, don't understand language. So how does a parrot know what's dangerous to it or not? How does a bird know? How does a cat know? So I guess the central question or the theme of this talk is, can we learn useful representations in the absence of labels? If we don't have these labels and we just have the observations, can we start making sense of the world? And can we start forming representations that are somehow useful? Many famous people in our field have been alluding to similar things over the past 2 or 3 years. And, including Hinton, Lacan, and Bengio, all saying that, what we really need to understand in order to make progress in AI is how such representations are formed in the absence of labels. Some people call this unsupervised learning. Now, just as a brief teaser, I want to highlight the fact that in the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a very significant change in our ability to do unsupervised learning. So we've thought about this for many decades, but only recently has it really started working in a way that's quite impressive. So, for instance, in language, it's now fairly well known that on many metrics, for instance, like here I'm highlighting squad performance, it's a particular task on a particular data set. If you compare methods that use pre-training, i.e. they use unsupervised pre-training, versus ones that only do supervised, like in the blue curve, you see that the methods that do utilize pre-training get much better performance with much less data. So the red curve is much higher than the blue curve. And for instance, like GPT-3 and all the interesting results that are happening in large language modeling are, of course, examples of this. But the same story also holds in computer vision, where, for instance, ImageNet performance, which is something that lots of people have been working on, we showed in a paper last year that if you compare methods that use pre-training, the blue curve, with ones that don't use any unsupervised pre-training in the red curve, the methods that do use unsupervised pre-training are much more data efficient, in that, with even as little as 1% of the labeled data, you get much better performance. So, by some metric, you can say that there's between 80% and 50% fewer labels, you get the same performance, which is very exciting. I'll go into these results a little bit later, but first, I want to talk about some of the building blocks that you have to consider when you're doing unsupervised representation learning. And just a quick reminder that if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll go through them together. So when we have this realm of images and we have this realm of representations from our introduction, there's really, if you think about it, only so much you can do. One thing you can do is you can go from images to representations, and some people call that representation as a verb, or they call it understanding as a verb. Or you can go from the realm of representations back to the realm of images, and some people call that generation as a verb or imagination as a verb. So, you know, another way of looking at it is that the red arrow is computer vision and the green arrow is computer graphics. And of course, in machine learning, we have lots of techniques for both of these arrows. So commonly known words or phrases used to describe these techniques are representation networks or encoder networks or inference networks. And I'm going to use a notation where, you know, an input is X, and imagine X is a high-dimensional image, which is fed to a representation network that produces a representation vector. And so as the designer of such a system, you get to choose, for instance, whether the representation has a certain size, like is it smaller or larger than the inputs? Does it have structure? Is it flat or is it interpretable? Is it continuous or is it discrete? Does the shape stay fixed or does the shape change in response to the contents of X? Is it disentangled or not? So given those choices, you have, you know, hundreds or thousands of different ways of implementing these representation networks. And of course, you will have seen some of them. For instance, there's multi-layer perceptrons, there's convnets, there's transformers, there's recurrent neural nets, and lots of other choices. Now, symmetrical to this, you have what some people call generation networks or generator networks or decoder networks that take the representation vector R, they pass it through this generation network indicated by green to produce a reconstruction of that image. Here I'm labeling it X prime. And generation networks, like representation networks, can be MLPs or convnets or transformers or recurrent nets. And I'll try to use the same kind of notation throughout the slides. And many of you will know that when you connect these two systems together, you end up with an architecture that's commonly known as an autoencoder. So an autoencoder takes an input X, it passes it through a representation network to get a representation R, and it passes this through a generation network to get a reconstruction X prime. And the two networks are trained to minimize the distance between X prime and X. The closer, if X prime is similar to X, then the claim is that this representation somehow captures the essence of X. So it's maybe a compressed version, or it's an interpretable version, or it's a structured representation of X. So I'm not going to go into like the basics of autoencoders because I feel many of you will have already heard about them. But I want to show you a variant of an autoencoder that we designed back in 2016, which is really the same structure, but with a little bit more complexity. And what we did was we said, you know what, like the representation network is going to be a recurrent system. The generation network is also going to be recurrent. And the representation, instead of it being a single vector, like to represent the whole image, it's going to be a sequence of vectors, one vector for each object in the scene. And moreover, that vector will have structure in the sense that part of it will represent whether the object is present or not. Part of it will represent what kind of object you're looking at, and part of it will represent where that object is. Now, we're going to train this whole thing unsupervised. And the goal, as before, is to take X and produce a reconstruction X prime. Now, if you do this well, you end up with a system where you get outputs like this. So let me explain what's going on. So on the left, you have the input image to the neural network after training. And on the right, you have the reconstruction produced by the system. And what you can see in red and green are visualizations that I've put on top which indicate where the network thinks the two objects are, or however many objects there are. So red is always the first object, green is always the second object. And to create this reconstruction, the network has this structure. You know, it has Z1 and Z2 representing the two objects, goes to the decoder and creates the reconstruction Y. Now, as I change the inputs, for instance, I clear it, I add an object, it locates it, it reconstructs it. I add a second object, it does the same thing. If I draw a 1, it gets it. If I draw it much larger, it says, oh, you know, it doesn't, from my data, it feels like this is two 1s that happen to be next to each other. If I draw an 8, it detects it. If I draw the 8 larger, it says it's more likely to be two 0s that are next to each other as opposed to one very large 8 that it's never seen before, and so on. So to me, what was most exciting about this project was that this system, I want to emphasize, was trained without supervision. So I never told it what objects look like or how to detect them, or what 1s look like and 2s and so on. So it's only looking at a bunch of images, and then it's trying to figure out a good interpretation of those images given the structure specified in advance. So as a researcher, I'm hypothesizing that this is a kind of structure that will lead to emergence of objects, for instance, which is, of course, a very important part of representation. Now, I want to talk about a different project and a different way of utilizing this auto-encoding architecture. So here, we still want to work with scenes that have multiple objects, but we don't want to have any structure in the network that relates to objects. We want that to be more of an emergent property of the system. So we created this kind of architecture where the representation network now can take one or more images of a scene. It could be a 3D scene. So it takes these images, and it also takes in a camera viewpoint associated with that image. So this photo was taken at V1. This photo was taken at V2. Those are processed with convex to produce a representation for the whole scene. Then the generation network, instead of reconstructing these images, is asked to reconstruct what it should see if it was in a new position V3. So the target for this generation is the image that would have been seen at V3. And our aim with this architecture was to say, well, the left side will have to do everything that it needs to do to produce a vector R that captures the essence of the scene. So like, how many objects are there? Where are the objects? What colors are they? How big are they? All of that stuff. And the reason it needs to do this, because that's the only way the generation network can produce good answers. So the only way to make an accurate prediction here for V3 is if R contains a good description of the scene. Yeah, and so the plus is literally summation. So this image is processed with convnet to produce R1. This is processed by convnet to produce R2, and these are literally vectors. And we just sum them together to get R. And the gradients that go through R and into R1 and R2 encourage the convnets to represent each image in a way that is summable, basically, where you can add them together. So if we dive a little bit deeper, here are some examples of this in action. So for instance, let's look at this second row. In the second row, we have 5 images of a scene from different viewpoints. And these are consumed by the network. And then we asked it to predict from a new viewpoint what it should see in that scene. So this is the true answer, and this is what the system produces. We see that, across scenes, it tends to get, most of the details correctly. And then our claim is that the only way it can do this is if R is a good representation for the scene, a good 3D representation for the scene. And moreover, the decoder is stochastic, which means that it can express uncertainty about the contents of the scene. So for instance, if I say, oh, you're looking at a wall, and that's the only information I'm giving you, and then I ask the system to produce what it thinks is behind the wall, then it produces samples like this. It says, well, it could be a purple sphere, maybe it's a blue cube, maybe it's 3 objects, maybe it's a green cylinder, and so on. So each time you ask it, it says, it could be this, it could be that, I'm not sure. I'm sure about the wall, but I'm not sure about what's behind it. Again, this is a really good outcome because it's very difficult to train this in a supervised way. And you'll notice that it doesn't say, oh, I think there's going to be like a purple dragon behind the wall. It's learned from the data what's likely and what's unlikely. And purple dragons don't appear in the data, therefore, it's not going to produce that as an answer. So before I answer the questions, I want to kind of finish this bit. So I'm going to show you some videos of this in action, where in the top you have the observations fed to the network. And the bottom, I have the output of the generator, and I'm changing V3. I'm changing the camera angle at which I'm asking it to produce an answer. So you see, as I rotate the query angle, you see coherent 3D scenes, again, which we claim contain a good description of the scene. So I can fly through the scene, it gets shadows, it gets the object counts, the object identities, and lots of other details. And remember that this is trained without supervision. I've never told it what an object is. I've never told it how to detect objects, or I've never put bounding boxes. I've never told it that there's something called a class and it's a string and so on. So it's all emergent from the training of the system. Okay, so before I go on, let me answer some questions. I was wondering how the results are different compared to using variational. Right, so with the variational autoencoder, if we go back to the VAE, it's possible to have a system that is a good autoencoder, even if the representation network and the generation networks are identities. So imagine this network does nothing. It just takes X and produces the same X as R. And then imagine the generation network does nothing and it produces the same R as X prime. That would have a perfect loss, but it would be a bad way of representing the world, because R would not be in any way more conceptual or abstract, or in any way like a better representation than X is. But if you look at this, our claim is that this is much harder to do when you're asking the system a question that isn't present directly in the inputs. So by forcing it to answer something that it can't just copy from the inputs, you force it to form representations R that are useful. So that's the claim. Okay, so there's quite a few questions here. Could we generate a scene from a non-representation? Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a second, the non-representation part. Human faces, we haven't tried this on human faces, but I think it would work very well. Did you provide camera pose? Yes. So these V's, they're all camera poses. And I think if I remember correctly, we did use quaternions to represent that pose. So it's like a bunch of numbers in each one of these V's. So recently, Bars and Lacun presented VIC Reg. Okay, so I'm not actually familiar with Bars and Lacun's paper, but I'll talk about contrastive learning in a second later in this talk. Okay, so let's continue, and we'll hopefully get to good places. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Some of you will have seen this paper, NERF, which is really interesting. It's very similar to what I just presented, but by using some really cool tricks, they can get much better performance in terms of visual fidelity from what I presented. And this might even allow applications in computer graphics or games, where you use these neural representations to store a description of a scene instead of doing it with computer graphics tools like 3D Studio Max or Maya. Now, in this next part, I want to talk about a particular application of this kind of model. So just to kind of motivate why we might want to do these unsupervised 3D representations. And to do that, I need to give a brief introduction to biology for those who might not be aware. So at a fairly decent level of granularity, we can represent the world as being made up of atoms. And atoms, of course, connect to each other to form molecules. And when you have molecules that are large enough and are made of certain kinds of atoms, those are called proteins. And proteins are essential to human life and animal life because all our cells and most of our body is made up of these proteins. So these proteins are like little machines that transport material from A to B, or they open up things, or they pass on information. They're really almost miraculous, I would say. And their function is determined by their shape. So the chemical bonds and the forces that operate on these molecules and on these atoms allow them to, for instance, move. They literally have legs, basically, and that allows them to move. It allows them to open up and close down, and operate as they need to. So as an example, all of us will have been affected by coronavirus. The coronavirus itself has these spike proteins on its surface, shown here. And these spike proteins, they are essential in the virus's function because the spike protein attaches to your human cells in blue, and then it opens up and it goes into your cell, and you see it happens at least twice, and it pulls the virus towards your cell, and then that's when the virus can take its contents and deliver it to your cell, and that's what gets you infected. So understanding how these proteins look in terms of their shape, that gives you a good understanding of their function. And many people and many scientists believe that when you understand their shape, you can design drugs to for instance, like target that function. So you can say, I'm going to disable coronavirus by creating a drug that has the right shape that connects to the spike protein to disable it from being able to do what it's doing. So how do we identify the shape of proteins? Well, it's basically by taking X-ray images. So you create a liquid form of that protein in a very concentrated manner, and then you put it on a flat sheet, and you take an image of this sheet with a microscope. So here I'm talking about cryo-electron microscopy, which is one way of doing this. And this sheet has many instances of the same protein in different orientations. And so you detect these protein particles, you clean up those images a little bit, and then you do a 3D reconstruction. So the task is, if I have multiple images of a protein, I want to understand the 3D shape of the protein that generated it. Hopefully you'll see how this is connected to Plato's allegory, and also like the paper that I just talked about with the 3D scenes. It's basically the same thing, but on a much, much smaller scale. So here's an example of a real micrograph. And here are some cleaned up images of the same protein in different orientations. And this is the kind of 3D model that's fit to that data. And the reason this image is so noisy is because if the X-rays or the rays are too strong, they actually destroy the protein. The proteins are very sensitive, and the rays have a lot of energy. So you can destroy the protein by shining too strongly on them. So they're always very noisy. Now, so the protein is a sequence of amino acids, as we discussed, or a sequence of atoms. So with the cryo-EM technique, you create a data set of images of that protein. So each protein will have hundreds of thousands of images. And then once you do this task of creating a 3D model, you have a 3D shape for that protein. So you've gone from one sequence to K images to one structure. And if you do this n times for n different proteins, you have n sequences, you have n data sets, and you have n structures. And many of you may have seen that a few months ago, my colleagues at DeepMind, they published a paper in Nature where they trained a neural network to predict, given a sequence, what the 3D structure would look like without needing to do the experimentation to take the photographs. And they had massive success. And I'll refer you to this paper if you're interested in learning more. It's a fantastic technique. And we wanted to go one step further and look at whether we can do something more than this. So in AlphaFold, the structure, the network that I just described, the proteins are described with a single 3D shape. But in reality, each protein is actually a flexible object. The shape changes all the time. And therefore, there's actually a distribution of structures in each data set. Now, what's really crucial is that we don't actually have ground truth labels. So we don't have any way to look at the protein in more detail than what is shown in these images. So we don't have a good sense of the 3D shape as it changes, and if we wanted to learn in a supervised way. But maybe unsupervised techniques can come to the rescue. And that's exactly what we did. So we use the autoencoder architecture in this way. So you start off with a noisy image. You have an inference network that produces a representation, potentially probabilistic, for the contents of that image. And then you have a network that takes that representation and brings it into the 3D world. So it produces 3D positions for the atoms. And then that 3D representation is rendered back into an image. And this, the red arrows and the green arrows are trained. And our hope is that once this thing is trained, then by investigating the distribution on the representation space, we can get a distribution on the 3D shapes of that protein. So the network is a little bit more complicated than that diagram, but I'm going to skip the details. But after training, you get results that look like this. So here you have an image. Below it, you have the reconstruction for that image. So this is what the input to the network is. This is what the network says is my reconstruction without noise. And just to simplify, for our visualization sake, we've shown the ground truth shape of the protein and the reconstructed shape of the protein, with each atom colored in a different color. The reason we have ground truth here is because this is simulated data. It's not real data. So you can see that the model generally does this accurately. So it's able to reconstruct the 3D shape of the protein from that image. And then once you have that, you can move in representation space and observe the way the 3D model changes as you move the latent vector. So you'll have seen this with GANs, and here we're doing it with this protein VAE. And here it is on a larger, more real protein where the model has learned the way in which it deforms. So this is like very initial investigations, but it's an example of how you can use these unsupervised representation learning techniques in order to understand a scientific phenomenon that otherwise would be effectively impossible to understand because there are no supervised labels. So I'm just going to take some questions here. How do you evaluate the structure? So I'm not an expert on this. We have some biologists that know how to evaluate it. Ultimately, you have to use real experiments to evaluate. So you make a prediction, and then you have to go and test your hypothesis in the lab to understand if your predictions about the shape distribution are accurate. And there's some sensors that can test. There's sensors that they don't tell you what the shape is, but if you make a guess as to the distribution of the shape, it'll tell you whether your guess matches reality or not. So I'm not an expert. What we did was we worked mostly with simulated data where we knew the ground truth, so we could evaluate that way. just as the first experiments. Does the model take care of the actual size of each single sequence of the protein? Yeah, basically. So all you're given is the sequence, and how this forms, like, does it become a small ball or a big ball? That has to be learned by the system. Does AlphaFold use only classic shape of protein structure like helix and beta sheets or not? I'm not sure I understand that question. I think in terms of how it describes the shape of the protein is pretty standard. So whatever is used commonly in the protein folding literature to describe the shape, I think it's the same thing. Obviously, that's the output, and internally the network is doing a very different kind of representation to make that prediction. Okay, I'm going to keep on going. So everything I talked about until now was based on reconstruction, and it was based on likelihoods. So the model represents, then it reconstructs, and the similarity of the reconstruction and the input is what drives learning. But that means that you have to have a good way of comparing an image with its reconstruction. If you don't have that, then everything fails. And actually, it turns out to be a very difficult problem, comparing two images. And many times when these systems fail, it is precisely because it's difficult to compare two images and give a good loss. So for that reason, we have techniques that try to learn how to compare two images. And generative adversarial networks are an example of that, where you actually introduce a third kind of network, which is called a discriminator, which takes an image as input and says, does this look real or not? Or does this look like a good reconstruction or not? And when you combine a discriminator with a generator, you end up with a generative adversarial network architecture, which I'm sure you've all seen produces really remarkable results. So these are samples from neural network models, and none of these samples actually exist in reality. These faces, they don't belong to anyone, they're computer generated. And the network that generates these is trained by another network that is trying very hard to tell the difference between these images and real images. Now, I want to highlight a paper that we worked on in 2018 and 2019, where we combined discriminators with a recurrent autoencoding architecture. And we did something additional where the decoder, instead of having a learned network, we used a fixed paintbrush simulator. So imagine like Photoshop. And the reason we did this was as follows. So we said, look, if I have an image, I look at it, or the computer looks at it, I wanted to represent that image as a sequence of brush movements, brush strokes. So this sequence of movements is specified to Photoshop, and those brush strokes combine with each other to produce the reconstruction X prime. So the idea is, instead of representing the image in an uninterpretable way, as a bunch of numbers, I wanted to represent it as a sequence of brush strokes. And because I know that X prime won't ever be a perfect reconstruction of X, because it's a painted version, it can't manipulate the pixels directly, then we're going to use a discriminator to evaluate the similarity of X prime and X, because only a discriminator we believe will be powerful enough to compare two things that actually look very different to each other. So here's an example of the system in action. We've trained it on handwritten characters, and it represents that character as a sequence of movements of a brush. And that sequence we can either just use to reconstruct the image, or we can actually send it to a real robot with a real paintbrush and produce that image. So this is cool because, as I said, it's a representation of that digit or that character, which is learned unsupervised. We've never shown it how a character is drawn, it only ever sees these images. But in its head, it knows it has to use a brush, and therefore it has learned how to represent that character with a brush. It's a little bit like how a child might have learned how to write by just looking at the characters in a book. Now, if you train this on faces, for instance, and you give the computer thousands of brush strokes to generate the image, you get results that look like this. So here it's producing two faces, and it's trying to make those faces look as real as possible. But unlike normal GANs, where it can manipulate the pixels directly, it has to do that with a brush. And so, the output is actually fairly reasonable, and maybe perhaps you could say it looks a bit like a painting. Now, what I really wanted to explore was, instead of saying you have 1,000 strokes, like what if you only have, say, 20 strokes? So I don't care about realism. What I care about is whether the computer can generate abstract representations of faces, maybe similar to how a novice would draw a face if it was only given like 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And this is the kind of image that is produced by the system if you restrict the number of strokes it has to use. So top left to bottom right is producing the strokes, and you can see in the bottom right that the output is in many ways, I would say, fairly conceptually abstract. So it uses a few strokes for the outlines of the face, a few strokes for the eyes, one stroke for the lips, and so on. So again, it's an interesting result in my view, because it's a hypothesis for how we come to look at a face and see like abstract forms in that face, like 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Of course, reality is hugely complex. There's so much going on each person's face, but yet kids, or like in emojis, we choose abstract representation. So this was like a hypothesis for how such abstractions could occur. Perhaps it's because of the physical nature of the tools that we use to reconstruct. Yes, the gradients through Photoshop, we learn. So we can't pass gradients through Photoshop because Photoshop's non-differentiable. So we actually train this as a reinforcement learning agent. So in a sense, Photoshop is in the environment, and we're training an agent that sends actions to the environment. So I really recommend you look at these papers to see how that was done. What was the similarity measure? So the similarity measure was learned. It was a discriminator that was learned, that was trying to tell whether X prime was real or fake. And of course, the discriminator can always tell this because X prime looks so bad in this problem. So we really constrain the discriminator so that we make this job hard. So it's almost like it's trying to tell the difference between real and fake, but it has very blurry vision, something like that. Again, I really encourage you to look at the paper to understand this a bit better. Okay. I'm going to go through these last sections a little bit fast because I'm keen to have some time for question answering. So very briefly, I want to mention that actually you don't have to generate at all. You don't have to reconstruct in order to learn good representations. So for instance, if you take a black and white image and you try to color the pixels in that image, you can only do that if you understand the contents. Like, I only know this is orange because it's a tiger, or this is green because grass. So you can use the task of colorization as a proxy task in order to learn class, or say rotation. I know this is a tiger which is upside down, therefore I will turn it back around. And in the process, I will learn about object classes without labels. And this field is sometimes called semi or self-supervised learning. And there's many tasks that fit into this category, but I want to talk about a particular type which came up in the questions and is very powerful at the moment, and that's contrastive learning. So in contrastive learning, what's commonly referred to as contrastive learning, you take an image you augment it, so you like play with its contrast or its brightness, or you crop it or you flip it. And you do this for another image as well, and you don't know the labels for these images. So it's like 2 random images from your data set. Then you take these images and you pass them through representation networks to get representations for those images. And the learning rule is very simple. It says the representations for these 2 images should be close to each other because the source was a common image. So even though the brightness might be different or the crop might be different, because they came from the same image, they should have the same class because the class won't be destroyed. But say R1 and R3 should be separate from each other because they came from 2 different images, and it's likely that they will be belonging to different classes. So this simple rule allows you to learn representation networks that are actually remarkably powerful. Now, you can't reconstruct in order to test the quality of the representation, so you have to do something a bit more quantitative. And so what people do, for instance, is they freeze this representation network at test time, and then they train a small network to translate the representations R into, for instance, ImageNet classes that we would understand. So this network, all it knows is that this image is a kind of object which is different from this kind of object, but it doesn't know that we use the words dog and tiger to describe them. So this green network is translating the network's representation into a language that we would understand. And the remarkable thing is that these techniques now work very well. So in this particular paper, SimClear, we get 76% accuracy on ImageNet with this linear readout. And what's amazing is that 76% is higher performance than AlexNet achieved in 2012, where everything was learned with supervision. So, you know, AlexNet was 7 layers or whatever it was, millions of parameters, learned entirely with supervision on ImageNet. And here, most of the network is being learned without supervision using contrastive learning. The last layer is being learned with supervision, and this system is doing better than the original AlexNet, which I think many of you will agree is quite exciting. I'm going to skip these slides because I want to leave some time for questions, but I kind of want to undermine the premise of my talk by actually saying that maybe it's a mistake to be too fixated on this notion of labels and trying to minimize the use of labels. And part of the reason for that is that in the past year, you know, literally in 2021, we've had lots of techniques that utilize, you know, extremely large models like transformer models and extremely large data sets to do some really interesting things. So, you know, VIT, Align and Clip from Google and OpenAI. Many of you will have seen DALL-E from OpenAI. These are techniques that take images and sequences of text, so not a single word, but a whole sentence. And for instance, they compute the affinity of the image and the text. Or DALL-E, it takes text as input and produces image as output. And these things are trained on massive, massive data sets. And the data is so big that almost the quality of the labels matters less because, you know, through the noise comes the signal. And I want to highlight a paper that we published a few weeks ago where we trained a system to interpret an image by encoding it into the same embedding space as a pre-trained language model. So we start off with a language model like GPT that's been trained on a massive text corpus. Obviously, this only understands language and it doesn't understand images. So we backpropagate gradients through the language model into a vision encoder so that this image is embedded in the same embedding space as that of a language model. And so after you've done this, you can do some really interesting things. So for instance, you give it an image and then you ask a question. You say, what color is the car? Answer. And then the computer completes the sentence by saying blue, end of sentence. So it looks at the image, it looks at the question, and it says this is the most likely continuation of that. Or you can say, well, here's an image, who invented this? The Wright brothers. Here's an image, who invented this? And the computer says Steve Jobs. So here, it not only has to understand the contents of the image to understand, oh, this is an iPhone, but it also has to utilize its background knowledge in the language model to know that iPhones were invented by Steve Jobs in order to answer this question. Or I'm going to skip this last one because it takes a bit of time to explain. But it's the beginnings of not shying away from using human language in human context in order to understand things visually. Just a few more examples. I guess this top one is one to. Yeah, it's true. iPhones. Yeah, I know that we've had lots of comments like this. Apparently, planes weren't invented by the Wright brothers either. So some of these are controversial, but it also points at the problem of language models, which is that they have biases, right? So as soon as we use human labels, we end up with mistakes like this. But yeah, I quite like this example here too, where it looks at this image, it understands that we're using emojis to describe images, and we say, what does this person look like? And it completes the emoji. So it's very fast binding of, in effect, language to images. Okay, I want to end the talk by making a claim, and maybe some of you will agree with this and maybe some of you won't. And the claim is that vision is hard for two very different reasons. One reason is that as humans, we care about categorization of things in the world. Like we care about the differences between cheetahs, leopards, and jaguars. And we give very different names to them, and we want systems that can identify these differences. A different difficulty of computer vision is that we only observe the world in a partial way. We never observe full reality. So we want systems that look at these two and understand that this is the same object from different viewpoints. Or when they look at this image, it understands that this animal exists behind the tree. It doesn't end where the tree starts. It still has legs and arms behind the tree. We don't know exactly where they are, but they're likely to be in this configuration and not something else. So in my view, it's these two challenges that make computer vision hard. And it's important to recognize that with categorization, the truth only exists in human brains. Like there is no true difference between, well, no, let me rephrase this. There is no true class cheetah or jaguar or leopard. Obviously, those differences exist, but we humans, we give them those names. Whereas the 3D configuration of these things actually does exist in real life. So if we had an alien come in, they would see the 3D world the same way we do, even though they might come up with very different names to describe those realities. So I would argue that maybe it's for categorization that we inevitably will have to use labels and supervision, but we might be able to go very far on this partial observability problem without labels. And maybe that's something that's worth pursuing now as a research topic.